Why were they already laughing at her when she hadn't even spoken? The room was loud, buzzing with the restless confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, flat glow across the SEAL's joint training bay. But the instant Arden crossly stepped inside, shoulders squared, boots quiet on the mat, she felt the shift. The way conversations dipped just enough for judgment to slip in unnoticed. It was always like this, always the same rhythm. Eyes scanning her frame, the plain Marine uniform, the simple blue t-shirt beneath it, the lack of ribbons, the sealed file they couldn't access. To them, she was a blank page. And blank pages in rooms like this got torn before anyone bothered to read them. She paused just inside the door, breath steady, heartbeat calm, too calm. The kind of calm that meant she'd been here before in other rooms with other men who thought strength was something you shouted, not something you carried quietly. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, let her gaze drift across the clusters of elite operators stretching, gearing up, showing off. No one met her eyes. No one thought they needed to. But she saw everything. Blake Hargrove leaned against a training dummy, his laugh too sharp, too forced, someone used to people bending when he pushed. Miles Keegan paced in a lazy circle, cracking his knuckles loud enough to make a point. Ronan Vale, the instructor, stood near the back, arms folded, face set in that familiar mask of disappointment reserved for anyone he considered less. Arden walked farther into the room, boots whispering over the mat. That was all it took. Blake peeled away from his group, blocking her path like he was swatting away a fly. "Well, look at that," he announced to no one and everyone. "Marine sent us a rookie." A ripple of chuckles spread across the room. Arden didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silence often said more than any comeback. Blake stepped closer, tilting the warm cup of coffee in his hand just enough for the dark liquid to splash across her right boot. It ran over the polished leather, dripping onto the mat. "Oh," he said, widening his eyes in mock concern. "Didn't see you there. Must have blended in with the furniture." Another laugh, louder this time. Arden looked down, not at him, at the stain. Then she lifted her head and stepped around him, smooth as a shadow, not touching him, not acknowledging him, just moving on. That made them angrier than if she'd swung a fist. Miles let out a low whistle. "Yo, Blake, she just ghosted you." "Rude," someone else muttered. "Marine etiquette must be slipping." Arden set her duffel against the far wall, fingers steady as she pulled her gloves free. She could feel the heat of their stares, the way their whispers twisted, a pack of wolves circling a deer they hadn't realized was actually a tiger. Ronan called for introductions. The room quieted, Arden straightened. "Crossley Arden, Marine Corps, here for combat integration training." Blake flipped a clipboard open. "Says here you're a—" He paused, squinted, leaned closer as if the ink offended him. "Combat master in the Marines." He barked out a laugh, and the room erupted with him. Miles pushed off the wall, expression bright with cruel amusement. "Combat master, is that like honorary participation trophy?" Arden didn't react. She learned long ago that reacting only lit the fuse they were begging her to ignite. But inside, under the stillness, something twisted. Not anger, no, that was too easy. It was that old ache, that familiar sting of being dismissed before anyone bothered to see her, that pull of memory of years she'd fought to be more than the quiet girl in the back row, more than the trainee instructors underestimated, more than the survivor who refused to break. Ronan moved on with the introductions, but the damage had been done. Arden could feel the shift. The SEALs no longer saw her as neutral. They saw her as prey. Miles drifted toward her duffel bag, his grin widening the closer he got. "Let's see what the mighty combat master brought to our elite session." He toe-kicked the bag, flipping it open, spilling its contents. A spare shirt, tape, a small silver match container rolling across the floor. He laughed, "Wow, real tactical." The men joined in with a chorus of "Library, library," and Arden's stomach tightened, not from fear but from memory. That chant, that rhythm, it transported her for a split second to another training field, younger faces, the smell of rain, the weight of expectations she had nearly drowned under. She pushed the memory away, grounding herself in the present. Miles stepped into her space, towering. "So what are you, Crossley? Some desk-bound Marine who wandered into the wrong room?" She stared past him at the far wall. That only made him push harder. "Come on," he sneered. "Combat Master sounds like a video game title." The circle closed around her like a tightening noose. Shoulders pressed in. Elbows brushed her sides. Voices layered over one another like a rising tide of arrogance. One SEAL muttered, "Bet she got the title for showing up early." Another added, "Look at her arms. I've seen bigger muscles on a cadet." Blake stepped closer, too close. "This is SEAL territory. We bleed for our titles. What have you done, Crossley?" The air thickened, heavy with challenge. Arden finally spoke, her voice quiet enough to force them to lean in. "Control." Miles scoffed. "Control, that your trick." She slid on her gloves. "It's a designation," she said softly. "Advanced close quarters control." The laughter exploded again. Blake shook his head, fake sympathy dripping from his tone. "Sweetheart, that might impress the Corps, but this is a different league." Something in her chest pulled tight, a string of tension, a small, deeply buried hurt that whispered, "You've been here before, you know what comes next." And she did. Because arrogance was predictable. Because men who carried their strength like a shield always reached for the same weapon: mockery, dismissal, belittlement, until they finally pushed too far. She scanned the room, counted bodies, counted exits, not because she planned to use them but because the habit was carved into her bones. The scanning kept her steady, a reminder she was not the trembling rookie they saw. Miles stepped even closer, noses nearly touching. "If you're so confident in this combat master thing," he said, voice dripping challenge, "why don't you prove it?" The room surged with excitement. Someone clapped, someone called, "Yeah, show us." Arden lifted her chin, calm, cold, measured. "If you want proof," she said, "set the terms." Silence rippled outward, replacing laughter with something darker: anticipation, surprise, a hint of fear none of them understood yet. Blake's grin spread slow and cruel. "Miles, go show her what real combat looks like." Cheers erupted. A few men shouted bets. The circle widened. Arden stepped onto the mat. The first hook of fear fluttered in her chest, not of losing, but of being seen. Truly seen. She'd spent so long hiding, blending, surviving in silence that stepping into the center of a room felt like peeling away armor. Her breath hitched. "They will see you now. For better or worse." Miles cracked his knuckles. 2 minutes, he bragged. Ronan raised a whistle. Arden exhaled once, long and slow. Then the whistle shrieked. Miles lunged. And the world clicked into silence. Her body moved before her mind did. A sidestep, a wrist catch, a twist, a weight shift. 2 seconds. Miles hit the mat with a choked gasp, face pressed into the floor, arm locked behind him so tightly he couldn't even breathe enough to curse. The room froze. Arden stepped back. Her breathing steady. Her heartbeat slow. But inside was something else, something shaking, not fear. Relief. Because for the first time in hours, for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt inevitable. What made him get up again, when even he knew he should? The question settled over the stunned room like dust after an explosion. Miles lay on the mat, blinking hard, his breath ragged, his arm trembling from a hold he couldn't begin to understand. But pride was a dangerous thing, especially in front of an audience. Especially when that audience was made of men who built their egos like armor. He pushed himself upright, face flushed red with humiliation. Blake leaned forward, trying to mask his own shock with rage. "Get up," he hissed. "Don't make us look weak." Miles swallowed, jaw tight, shaking his arm out like the pain was nothing. But Arden could see it, the micro-tremor in his fingers, the slight tightening of his shoulder. She'd hit a nerve cluster, hit it perfectly. He shouldn't even be standing. Ronan stepped closer to the mat, confusion etched deep in his brow. He'd expected a scuffle, a lesson, not a dismantling. Miles didn't wait for a signal this time. He rushed her, faster, harder, the kind of charge meant to overwhelm. For a heartbeat, Arden saw something else, something flickering at the edge of memory. Rain, mud, a taller opponent, a scream of effort, a flash of pain across her shoulder. She blinked it away. Miles swung. She moved. Not quickly, just correctly. A pivot, a shift, a strike, a gentle guiding of momentum where it already wanted to go. He hit the mat harder than before. The sound echoed. The room inhaled as one. Arden stepped back, chest rising and falling in an even rhythm, her expression unchanged. But inside, a familiar weight tugged at her, a loneliness she never spoke of, a tired ache from years of being the one who walked away while others whispered. She had learned long ago that when you were exceptional, people hated you for it until they needed it. And today, they didn't need it. They needed someone to belittle. Miles wheezed, struggled but tried again. Arden didn't want to hurt him. She didn't want this to be a spectacle. She only wanted room to breathe, space to exist without being torn down. But they wouldn't allow that. So she did what she had trained her entire life to do. She controlled. Miles lunged a third time, more desperate than trained. Arden stepped aside as if moving away from an approaching shadow. Her palm met the side of his neck, not hard, just precise, a clean nerve strike. His legs buckled before he even felt the pain. He crumpled. Silence filled the room so completely, she could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights again. Someone whispered, "What the hell?" Blake stared, color draining from his face. He wasn't ready, he wasn't. But no one was listening to him anymore. Two SEALs stepped forward instinctively, Sampson and Reed, broad-shouldered, sweat already dripping from their brows. Arden lifted her hands slightly, palms out, a peaceful gesture. "You don't need to." But pride made people deaf. Both rushed her at once, one high, one low, a smart tactic, a practiced tactic, a tactic drilled into them until it was muscle memory. Arden processed it in half a breath. She ducked beneath the first, redirected the second with her shoulder, used the force of his charge to topple him into his partner. A fluid sequence, a dance she didn't want to perform but had been forced into. One man crashed into the wall. The other hit the floor with the wind crushed out of him. The room pressed back instinctively, forming a wider circle. Fear, sharp and electric, replaced the earlier arrogance. Breath after breath seemed to stutter around her. But in her chest, something trembled, not triumph. Sadness. Because every takedown reminded her how different she was, how far apart she lived from anyone who might understand. She looked around at all the faces, faces that had burned her with mockery minutes ago. Now they gazed at her like a weapon misfired. Even that felt familiar. She hated how familiar it felt. Blake finally spoke, but the words cracked. This isn't real. She's cheating. She's something else." Ronan didn't answer. He was too busy watching her hands, the scars, the calluses, the steady, relaxed way she held them, fingers slightly curled, not in tension but in readiness. He'd seen fighters, many, he'd taught hundreds, but this was different. Miles dragged himself to a sitting position, eyes wide. What are you?" Arden didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because she was tired of explaining herself to men who had already decided she was less. Ronan stepped onto the mat at last, boots heavy, face pale. Crossly, your file says Combat Master. That's not a standard Marine credential. Arden turned her head slightly. She didn't like where this was going. She had survived so long by staying in the shadows, by keeping the truth buried under layers of sealed documents and classified missions. But the moment Blake had mocked her, the moment Miles had spilled her bag and kicked her belongings like they meant nothing, she had known this day, this exposure, was inevitable. Still, she stayed silent, because once they knew who she really was, everything would change. Blake pressed forward, desperate to regain even a fragment of his crumbling dominance. Combat master of what? Filing paperwork, being a Marine Barbie. Ronan shot him a sharp look, but Blake didn't notice. He kept going. You're nobody, Crossley. You walk in here with some fancy title and expect us to believe you're. She looked up. Just that. Just lifted her eyes and met Blake. And the words died in his throat. Because for the first time, Blake didn't see a quiet Marine girl with no ribbons, no noise, no presence. He saw the truth bleeding through the cracks of her calm, something cold, something disciplined, something dangerous, something he wasn't ready to understand. Before Blake could process that fear creeping into his spine, Sloane's chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone turned. Cole Sloane stood with a stiff, unsettling slowness, his expression unreadable as he approached the locked cabinet at the corner of the room. "What are you doing?" Ronan asked, voice thin, uncertain. Sloane didn't answer. He slid a key into the cabinet, turned it, opened it, and pulled out a folder marked with a stripe of red. Classified authorized personnel only. Blake's face paled. Miles swallowed hard. Ronan's eyes widened. Arden froze. Her heart, so calm all day, finally stumbled. Sloane placed the folder on the table. His hands didn't shake, but Arden recognized the heaviness in his posture. He didn't want to do this. He was about to reveal something she had built her entire life around concealing. "Cole," Arden whispered, barely audible. He paused. His eyes softened. "Arden," he said quietly, "they need to know. This has gone far enough." But she wasn't worried about embarrassment or pride. She was worried about what the truth did to people. How it changed rooms, changed relationships, changed trust. Because she had spent years fighting to be ordinary, quiet, overlooked, hidden. Now, with one fold of paper, she was about to become something else. Something she never wanted to be again. A myth. A warning. A weapon. Sloane flipped the folder open, and the room held its breath. Arden closed her eyes. A wave of unwanted memory hit her chest like a tide. She wasn't afraid of them. She was afraid of the loneliness that always came afterward. Of the way people pulled back, not in mockery but in reverence. She hated reverence more than laughter. She hated being seen as a ghost, a story, a thing. But the seals had pushed too far. They demanded proof. And the universe, in its cruel symmetry, was about to give it to them. Slowly, almost reverently, Sloane lifted the first page. The men leaned in. Arden's heart ached. Not because of the exposure, but because she knew what would follow. The silence, the distance, the fear disguised as respect, and the isolation she had spent her whole life walking through. She took a slow breath, prepared herself, because once the truth fell into the open, none of them would look at her the same way ever again. Why did the room feel colder before anyone even touched the classified file? Because truth changes temperature, and everyone in that silent circle felt the drop. Sloane didn't rush. He lifted the first page with deliberate care, the way someone handles something radioactive. The seals leaned in. Blake's bravado leaked out of him drop by drop. Miles flexed his fingers subconsciously, as if trying to erase the memory of how easily she had folded him. Arden stood still. Too still. Not rigid, not defiant. Just resigned. As if this moment wasn't a victory. As if exposure felt more like punishment than vindication. Sloane cleared his throat, but his voice still wavered on the first word. Arden Crossley, Marine Combat Master, 7th generation. Confusion rippled across the men. 7th, Miles muttered. Since when is that even a thing? It isn't, Blake snapped, desperate, clinging to normalcy. This is a joke, a title. But Sloane turned the page. And the photographs killed every word on Blake's tongue. The first image showed a grainy thermal view, one small figure weaving through a burning alleyway while armed hostiles swarmed around her. She moved like smoke, slipping between walls of heat, surviving where no one should. This operation, Sloane said quietly, took place in Al-Rashid, hostile zone, 43 insurgents, a diplomat trapped in a collapsed corridor, entire Marine unit pinned down. Ronan blinked. I remember that mission. No one knew how the extraction happened. The report was incomplete. Because she did it, Sloane said. The room stiffened. Blake stepped back involuntarily. Miles sucked in a sharp breath. A younger SEAL whispered a curse. They weren't looking at Arden anymore. They were looking at the shadow of her legend. Sloane continued. Crossley was inserted alone. No rifle, no comms, close quarters only. She built a path through that building using nothing but a broken pipe, a knife, and controlled strikes that neutralized threats without triggering alarms. Arden didn't flinch. She already knew the story. She lived it, survived it, carried it like a scar pressed into her spine. But hearing it aloud brought back one detail no report ever captured, the fear. Real fear. The moment she felt the corridor tremble beneath her boots as the fire closed in, the diplomat barely conscious at her back. She had been 19. Barely more than a shadow herself. Ronan stared at her now as if seeing a ghost. You did all that. Arden didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't a badge of pride. It was a weight she never wanted them to carry. Sloane turned another page. A list of sealed missions, survival rates, names redacted, techniques marked as beyond standard issue. A symbol in the corner of each report, an angular insignia that made Ronan step closer. I've seen that, he whispered. Years ago, rumor level, those combat protocols that weren't supposed to exist. Miles backed up. Hold up, she's real, those stories. Arden hated this part. The moment the room changed shape. The moment people saw not a person, but a myth wearing a uniform. No, Blake said, voice cracking with fragile denial. This is exaggerated, fabricated. No single Marine can. Sloane tapped another document onto the table. A body cam still frame. Arden mid-motion, breaking a chokehold with a movement so swift the camera barely captured it. Eyes focused. Blood streaked across her cheek. A burning vehicle in the background. The silence deepened. Blake's defiance collapsed into a hollow stare. Arden finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That file was sealed for a reason. Sloane nodded. Because you were assigned to observe elite units, not as a trainee, not as a student. His eyes turned to the SEALs, but as a corrective measure. Miles's jaw hung open. Corrective like to keep us in check. Arden swallowed, to keep you alive. Shock cracked across the circle like lightning. Ronan ran a hand down his face, years of pride unraveling in his expression. My God, we mocked you. We shoved you aside like a nobody, she finished quietly. The truth stung the room. Every man felt it. But the part that cut deeper for Arden was the ache blooming behind her ribs. She didn't want their shame, didn't want their awe. She didn't want them looking at her like something superhuman when all she'd ever wanted was simple human space. The space to breathe, to belong, to not be a threat. Her silence wasn't strength, it was survival. Blake moved suddenly, packing, breathing too fast, his mind tripping over itself. No, no, this is insane. If she's some elite asset, why send her here? Why us? Arden looked down at her hands. The scars, the lines, the quiet violence they had memorized over the years. For the same reason I'm always sent, she said. Her voice tightened. To see what pride will break first. Blake's eyes hardened. This is bull, you're trying to embarrass us, set us up. Arden's gaze met his, not angry, just unbearably calm. You embarrassed yourselves. He flinched. But something uglier replaced his shame, rage born of fear. You think you're better than us, Blake hissed, stepping closer. You think one cheap takedown and some classified photos make you. Arden cut him off with a single, cold look. Better, no, just trained differently, for different reasons. Sloane shut the folder. Enough, Blake. No, Blake snapped, pointing at Arden. She played us, lied to us. She's here undercover, watching us screw up so she can report back. Stop, Sloane's voice thundered through the room. But Blake was too far gone. His world had cracked, and he was desperate to piece it back with whatever shards of arrogance he could grab. Ronan stepped forward to restrain him, but Blake shoved him away. He lunged at Arden. Not with technique. Not with strategy. With panic. Arden didn't move. Not because she couldn't. Because she didn't want to hurt him more. She simply stepped aside. Blake stumbled past her, tripping over his own momentum, crashing into the mat with a thud that echoed with far more humiliation than pain. The room stared, and Arden felt something twist deep inside. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Grief. Because she could see the fracture in Blake's pride. Because she knew what it felt like to be broken by your own anger. Because once, years ago, she had been him, a soldier who thought her worth came from noise, not silence. He pushed up off the mat slowly. His hands shook, his voice was ragged. You ruined us, he whispered, not to her, but to the floor beneath him. Arden shook her head. No, you did that yourselves. Sloane slowly approached her, not with hesitation, but with something like respect, a quiet, steady acknowledgement that didn't suffocate or worship. Arden, he said softly, I'll handle the fallout. You don't have to stay for this. Her jaw clenched. I never wanted fallout, I wanted a training session. And that was the truth that hurt her most. She hadn't come here to dominate, or expose, or be a legend dragged into the light. She'd come to learn, to blend, to be normal for a day. But normal had never belonged to her. Miles whispered from the corner, voice hoarse. Why didn't you just tell us? Arden looked at him, eyes tired, not triumphant. Because people only listen after they hurt you first. Miles looked away. Blake sank to his knees. Ronan rubbed his temples, finally understanding the consequences of his silence. And the room, once loud with confidence, now felt like a confession booth. Arden exhaled, feeling the weight of old memories crashing softly against her ribs. The years of doubt. The endless training. The loneliness of being weaponized instead of supported. She turned to pick up her jacket. But she paused. Because standing there, surrounded by men who finally saw her, she felt something she hadn't expected. A small, flickering grief for the girl she used to be. The one who had once wished someone, anyone, would see her before she had to prove herself. But they never did. Not until she broke something. Not until she bled. Not until she fought. That was the curse of her skill. And the burden she carried into every room. She lifted the jacket, folded it over her arm and walked toward the door. No applause, no cheers, no triumph, just silence. The kind that didn't feel victorious. The kind that felt like truth finally settling into place. A truth none of them were ready for. A truth she had lived her whole life with. Strength is a lonely language. What do you do when the room finally knows the truth, yet the truth only makes you feel more alone? Arden felt the weight of that question pressing on her chest as she walked toward the door. Every step echoed through the training bay, each one tapping against the silence she'd unintentionally created. It wasn't victory that followed her. It wasn't admiration. It was distance. The kind of distance that grows when people don't know whether to fear you, or apologize, or avoid you altogether. Her hand reached for the door, but she didn't push it open. A quiet voice behind her stopped her. Arden, don't go. Sloane. His tone didn't carry authority, not even suggestion. It carried worry, concern, something rare in the military world and rarer still in this cold room that had mocked her less than an hour ago. She didn't turn around yet. She closed her eyes, because she didn't want to see the expressions on their faces. She didn't want to see the guilt or the awe or the fear. She didn't want to feel like a weapon again. She just wanted to breathe. Arden, Sloane repeated, footsteps soft as he approached. We're not done. She sighed quietly. I am. No, you're not. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned. The circle of elite operators who had crowed like caged roosters now stood scattered, small, deflated. Miles sat slumped on a bench, still rubbing his wrist, eyes downcast. Ronan stood with his hands on his hips, breathing like a man who'd lost a piece of himself. Blake looked broken. He stood stiffly, his pride gutted, shoulders shaking with breaths he tried desperately to control. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Arden swallowed the ache pressing into her sternum. I didn't come here to expose anyone, Cole. I know. I didn't want this. I know. I just wanted to train. Sloane nodded, his expression soft. And you should, but not like this, not walking away with all of them drowning in confusion and ego wounds they don't know how to stitch. Arden's gaze swept the room, sweat, shame, shock painted on every face. They wouldn't have cared about my identity, she said bitterly. They only care now because I beat them. Ronan flinched. Miles looked up, eyes haunted. No, he whispered, we care because we were wrong. Those words struck her in a place she didn't expect. Not because she needed their validation. Not because she wanted them to grovel. But because she had spent years receiving apologies that were never really apologies. Yet now, Miles meant what he said. And that sincerity startled her more than any punch. Blake shifted, eyes still glued to the floor. His voice cracked. I didn't know. Arden exhaled quietly. You didn't want to know. He winced, like the truth bruised him harder than her throws ever could. Sloane placed the folder down gently, as if closing it made the room less fragile. She wasn't undercover to spy or judge. She was sent to provide friction where discipline erodes. Ronan nodded weakly, to keep us from turning into our own worst enemies. A bitter smile tugged at Arden's lips. Funny, I couldn't even keep myself from becoming the thing I hated. What's that? Sloane asked. She hesitated, then let the words fall from a place much deeper than pride. A story people fear before they understand. Miles mumbled, we don't fear you. But Arden gave him a knowing look. And he looked away. Because sometimes the truth is louder in the silence that follows it. Blake finally lifted his head. His eyes were red. I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. Wasn't loud. Wasn't performative. It was the cracked, quiet voice of a man realizing he had spent years confusing dominance for leadership. A man who had measured others with a broken ruler. A man who had believed strength was loud because he himself had always been afraid of silence. Arden's throat tightened. Not from vindication. Not from triumph. She felt sad. Sad that it took this to humble him. Sad that people often only learn after causing damage. Sad that it was always her job to be the mirror that reflected their blind spots. She stepped forward slightly, her tone low, controlled. Blake, it was never about winning. You pushed a stranger without knowing her. That's the danger, not me. Blake nodded, shame dragging his posture down. I know. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of unspoken truths filled the room. Then Sloane broke the silence. We still have an entire training block left, he said, directing the words to Arden. If you want to teach, we learn. If you want to spar, we spar. If you want to walk, you walk. But don't leave thinking you're alone in this room. Arden stared at him. Something in her chest pulled tight, something she had buried for years. Because she wasn't used to someone offering her choice. She wasn't used to someone asking what she wanted. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions. Let them decide, Arden said quietly. It's their space. Ronan stepped forward, clearing his throat, crossly. He hesitated. Words were hard for him, harder than commands, harder than criticism. Finally he managed, we want to learn. Miles nodded slowly. Yeah, we do. The others murmured in agreement, even Blake, who gave the slightest nod, eyes wet. Arden took a breath. Not deep. Not steady. Just enough to feel human again. She stepped onto the center mat. Then we start over. The room shifted. Not militarily. Not formally. Humanly. Sloane closed the folder and slid it back into the cabinet. Not to hide her truth, but to protect the room from turning her into something unreachable. Arden loosened her shoulders. First lesson, locate your center, not physical, emotional. Miles blinked, emotional. Ronan groaned, oh God. Arden almost smiled, almost. You fight with your bodies, she said softly. But your worst battles start in your head. Pride gets you killed. Fear gets you sloppy. Anger gets you predictable. Control comes from knowing what you carry inside before you strike outside. The men listened. Really listened. For the first time all day, her voice held weight, not because she proved herself with force, but because she spoke from a place they recognized. Raw experience. Private wounds. Quiet strength. Training isn't about beating someone, Arden continued. It's about leaving each other better than you found them. Blake lowered his head. Miles nodded slowly. Ronan breathed out, almost in relief. Arden stepped into a ready stance. So, who's first? Surprisingly, Blake stepped forward. Everyone stiffened. Arden studied him. His voice shook. I don't want revenge, I want to learn. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Good, come here. He approached cautiously, almost reverently, not because she scared him, but because shame had finally stripped him down to something real. As he stepped onto the mat, memories flickered behind Arden's eyes, of nights training until her knuckles bled, of instructors pushing her to the edge, of being underestimated again and again, until silence felt safer than speaking. She swallowed that ocean of memory and lifted her hands. Blake, keep your guard loose. You're not punching the world, you're moving with it. He mirrored her stance. Awkwardly, nervously, humanly. And with that simple first step, the room began to mend. For the next hour, Arden didn't throw a single man. She didn't break pride. She didn't dominate. She taught. Gently, patiently, quietly, And slowly, the room, which had once felt like a battlefield, started feeling like a place where respect didn't have to be forced. Sweat replaced tension. Laughs replaced fear. Questions replaced mockery. By the time the session ended, the lines of hierarchy had softened. The arrogance had cracked. The men walked differently, lighter, quieter, more aware. Arden set her gloves on the bench, her breath steady. For once, she wasn't the ghost in the corner. She wasn't the hidden legend or the myth or the threat. She had simply been part of the room. As she picked up her jacket, Blake approached with hesitant steps. "Crossly," he said quietly, "I don't know how to fix what I said, but thank you for staying." She nodded once. "Learn from it, that's enough." He exhaled, relief softening the corners of his eyes. And for the first time, they looked at her not as a ghost, not as a weapon, not as a rumor, but as a soldier, a teammate, a human being. Arden walked toward the exit again. This time, no one tried to stop her. And for the first time since the day began, she didn't feel alone walking out the door. Why did the hallway feel louder when no one was walking behind her? Arden paused 3 steps outside the training bay, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud that echoed far longer than it should have. The corridor was empty, sterile walls, humming lights, distant footsteps somewhere far off. And yet, the noise inside her head was deafening. Not the adrenaline, not the memory of the takedowns, not the weight of the classified file. It was something simpler, something painful. Relief. The kind of relief that hurts. Because the session hadn't ended in chaos. It hadn't spiraled. The room hadn't turned into the battlefield she feared it would become. Instead, they listened. They learned. They tried. And that made her chest feel uncomfortably warm in a way she didn't trust. She took a slow breath, grounding herself against the wall, feeling the concrete's coolness against her back. "You did good in there." Sloane's voice drifted down the hallway before she even heard his steps. He approached quietly, hands tucked behind him, expression thoughtful, not assessing, not calculating, just present. Arden didn't lift her head. Good wasn't the point. It was for them. She swallowed. "I didn't want them to break." Sloane nodded. "You didn't let them." She finally met his eyes. There was a softness in his gaze that made her feel exposed, not as a weapon, not as a legend, but as someone tired, someone who'd carried too much for too long. "You going to be all right?" he asked gently. Arden almost laughed, a hollow exhale. Being all right was never part of the job description. Sloane leaned against the opposite wall, loosening his shoulders. He studied her the way a father might study a child who'd learned to carry burdens too heavy for their size. "You know," he said, "I was there the first time your name crossed my desk." Arden stiffened, her voice thinned. "I didn't ask to be used like this." "I know," he said softly, "but you were the only one who didn't break." She looked away, jaw tightening. "Does that make it worth it?" Sloane didn't answer, because deep down he knew the truth. Nothing made it worth it. Silence settled between them again, steady and unforced. Arden wasn't good at emotional conversations, but Sloane didn't push. He let the quiet sit until it became natural. Finally, he spoke again. "You could stay longer," he offered. "Help out with advanced drills tomorrow. The team listens when you speak. That's rare." Arden shook her head. "That's not why they listened." "No," Sloane agreed. "But they will next time, and not because of the file, because of you." Something flickered behind her eyes, something soft, fleeting, fragile. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him, her boots echoing down the hall in that steady, measured rhythm she'd perfected to keep herself calm. Sloane didn't follow. He just watched her go, understanding more than she realized. Outside, dusk had settled over the base. The sky was a muted orange, fading into deep blue at the edges, the air thick with the smell of fuel and engine grease from nearby hangars. A transport helicopter sat on the tarmac, its blades spinning lazily as mechanics checked diagnostics. Arden found her small bench near the fence, her refuge. She sat down, elbows on her knees, letting the evening breeze cool her heated skin. The quiet wrapped around her like a thin blanket. Finally, finally, she could breathe without being watched. She tugged the silver match container from her pocket, flipping it open with a familiar click. Inside, the handwritten note lay folded neatly. The storm does not argue with the mountain. It simply breaks against it. She stared at the words. She'd been the storm for so long. And today, she'd been the mountain too. A strange ache filled her chest. Footsteps approached. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Miles. His gait was unmistakable, fast, nervous, slightly uneven from the lingering pain in his wrist. He hovered awkwardly a few feet away. Can I?" Arden gestured to the empty space beside her. Miles sat, shoulders hunched, hands clasped between his knees. He stared ahead at the runway lights blinking like cautious fireflies. "I replayed it," he said quietly. "The way you moved, the way I rushed in without thinking, I've never felt that outmatched." Arden didn't reply. Crossly, he continued, "I was an ass, a complete one." Still, she didn't respond. He swallowed hard. "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to teach us anything after what we did." "That's why I had to," she finally said. Miles frowned. "I don't get it." She tucked the match container back into her pocket. People don't learn from comfort. They learn when they're shaken, when they're embarrassed, when they see the flaw in their own logic. A pause. And when someone they underestimated chooses not to punish them. Miles looked down, guilt clouding his expression. "Arden." She waited. "That moment, when you took me down the first time, I wasn't scared of you." She raised a brow. "No." "No," he said softly. "I was scared of myself, scared of the version of me that laughed at someone who didn't deserve it." Arden blinked slowly. That was new. She didn't expect honesty, not this raw, not this vulnerable. "You taught me something I didn't know I needed," Miles continued. "Not about fighting, about being better." Arden's voice softened. "That's why I stayed." Miles exhaled shakily. "Does it get easier being whatever you are?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Being different never gets easier. You just learn to carry it without breaking." Miles nodded slowly. "Then I'll try to learn from you, even the hard parts." She turned to him fully then, really looking at him. Not as the cocky seal who mocked her. Not as the arrogant fighter who underestimated her. But as a young soldier trying to grow. "Good," she said, "because the world doesn't need perfect soldiers, it needs honest ones." The lights on the runway flickered brighter as night settled in. The bass quieted. A truck rumbled somewhere far off. The wind shifted. Miles stood. "If you ever train here again, I'd like to be first in line." Arden considered him. And nodded. He smiled, small, respectful, grateful, and walked back toward the barracks. Arden remained. Alone. But not lonely in the same familiar way. For once, the silence around her didn't feel like exile. It felt earned. It felt like peace. And yet deep under that peace, another question stirred. Why did her chest feel heavy, even after everything had gone right? Because victory wasn't what she wanted today. She wanted belonging. She wanted quiet understanding. She wanted a place where she wasn't myth or threat or anomaly. She wanted to be seen without being feared. The wind brushed faintly against her cheek as she stood, adjusting her jacket. The world was still waiting for her. And somewhere inside her, a whisper said, "This isn't over yet, Something is coming. Something she didn't want to face. Something she thought she'd left in the shadows of old missions. She walked away from the bench. Her boots echoed into the night. And for the first time in years, she wondered if she was ready for what waited beyond the next dawn. Why did dawn feel heavier, like the sun was rising on a day she didn't choose? Arden sensed it before she even opened her eyes. That subtle shift in the air. That quiet tension beneath the humming bass generators. That instinctive tightening in her spine that whispered, something is about to break. She sat up slowly in her quarters, the room dim except for the thin line of pale orange slipping through the blinds. Her boots stood at the foot of her bed, still carrying yesterday's dust. Her jacket hung on the chair, creases soft but deep. Her duffel lay closed too neatly, the way she always packed when she felt movement coming. She didn't know where she was going next, but her bones knew she wasn't staying. Not after yesterday. Not after being seen, too clearly, too publicly, too loudly. Even if the seals learned something. Even if the room had softened. Even if the echoes of mockery had turned into respect. Exposure was a wound, no matter how gently it was made. Arden tied her hair back, each motion slow, deliberate. A small routine that calmed the pulse she could feel beating at the base of her throat. A knock broke the quiet. 3 taps. Even spacing. Controlled. Sloan. Arden didn't call out permission. She simply opened the door. He stood there with a tablet under his arm, fatigue visible in the lines etched around his eyes. But there was something else too, hesitation. The rare kind she only saw from men who had to deliver news they didn't want to give. "Walk with me," he said gently. She nodded, slipping into her jacket as she followed him down the hall. The morning shift had begun, boots marching, calls echoing across the base, engines starting. Soldiers saluted passing officers. Instructors barked orders across the field. But everywhere Arden walked, conversations dipped, heads shifted. Eyes followed her like she was a rumor materialized in flesh and bone. She ignored it. Mostly. Sloan led her toward the far end of the base, near the older barracks, the quiet ones reserved for visiting personnel and classified teams. The air here was colder, heavier. "Something happened overnight," Sloan finally said. Arden waited. He turned his tablet toward her. A digital message glowed on the screen. A request. No, an order. Straight from command. Asset Crossley. Immediate reassignment. Operative required for Shadow Protocol evaluation. Departure within 48 hours. Arden inhaled slowly. Shadow Protocol. A ghost inside a ghost. A mission that didn't exist. A place only the forgotten were sent. Not because they were expendable, but because they were essential. Sloan watched her face closely. "I tried to stall it." "I know," she murmured. "Arden, they pulled your sealed file. Someone upstairs must have flagged yesterday's incident. You weren't supposed to stand out." She gave him a small, humorless smile. "I never am, yet here we are." Sloan pressed a hand to the back of his neck, frustration tugging at him. "You could refuse. You've earned the right to." "No," she cut in, "I haven't." He opened his mouth, closed it again, because he knew she was right. She wasn't a volunteer. She was a tool shaped by generations of silence, sharpened by necessity. And tools didn't get choices. Arden handed the tablet back. "When do I leave?" 48 hours, Sloan repeated, his voice heavy. "But Crossley, it's not just reassignment." She waited. "They want you to lead it." Something cold slid through her ribs. Lead meant command. Lead meant responsibility. Lead meant stepping into the light she had spent her life hiding from. She looked away toward the runway where a transport jet roared to life. "They want results, Cole. That's all they ever want." "That's not all I want," he said quietly. Her gaze snapped back to him. His eyes held something she didn't expect. Something that unsettled her more than any mission ever had. "Arden," he said softly, "yesterday you did more than fight. You changed an entire room with your restraint, with your patience, with your strength. I've seen operatives with skills like yours turn cold, violent, unreachable. But you," he exhaled, "you're still human, even after everything." She didn't know what to do with that. Compliments were harder to carry than wounds. Praise felt heavier than silence. Sloane continued, his voice roughening. "I don't know where they're sending you, but wherever it is, don't lose that part of yourself." Arden looked down at her hands. The scars, the calluses, the story written in skin. "I won't," she said quietly. "It's the only part they never managed to train out of me." Sloane smiled softly. "Good." They walked until they reached the old mission boards, empty now, glass cases reflecting the morning light. Arden paused in front of them. Sloane stopped a few steps ahead, but when he realized she wasn't following, he turned back. "Something wrong?" She touched the glass lightly. "No, just thinking." "About what?" "Yesterday." Sloane stepped closer. Arden didn't look at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "What did you think of me before you opened that file?" He blinked, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "I thought you were quiet," he said honestly. "Observant, hard to read, someone carrying something heavy. And now," he exhaled slowly, "now I know what you carry, and I respect you more for surviving it." Arden nodded once, a tiny, fragile acceptance. Then she stepped back. "Will the team be all right?" she asked. Sloane nodded. "They're shaken, but in a good way. You taught them something no instructor could have, something humbling, something they needed." A faint warmth touched her chest, unwanted, unfamiliar, but real. "Good," she murmured, "then it was worth it." She turned toward the exit. But Sloane called her name one last time. "Arden." She stopped. He hesitated. "Do you ever get tired of being the strong one?" The question pierced deeper than he knew. She shut her eyes, breath trembling at the edges. "Yes," she whispered. "Then, but I don't know how to be anything else." Sloane's voice softened. "Maybe one day you won't have to be." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, she stepped outside into the cold morning air, letting the wind sting her cheeks awake. The base stretched before her, busy, loud, alive. A place she would soon leave behind, another footprint erased from the sand. She walked toward the perimeter fence, where the world beyond the base shimmered with the beginning of the day. Every step felt heavier than the last. And that question followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Where does someone like her go, when all she knows how to be is strong? She reached the fence, rested her hands on the cold metal wire, and closed her eyes. She thought of the seals, how their arrogance had cracked and softened. She thought of Miles, trying to be better. She thought of Blake, learning humility for the first time. She thought of Sloane, offering the rare kind of care she didn't know how to accept. And she thought of Shadow Protocol, the next storm waiting for her. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of jet fuel and morning, dew across the field. Arden exhaled. Whatever waited for her next, whatever storm she'd have to walk into, she would face it the same way she always had. Silent, steady, unbroken. Because sometimes dignity doesn't raise its voice. Sometimes strength doesn't need to shout. Sometimes greatness isn't loud, it's lonely. And as she turned away from the fence, heading back toward the barracks for the last time, the first moral of her next mission whispered through her mind like a quiet truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.